Okay, today we're looking at a really interesting figure from ancient Greece, Protagoras of Abdera. We've got some material that paints a picture of his life and, maybe more importantly, his key philosophical ideas.
He's definitely someone whose thoughts still provoke discussion.
Absolutely. Our goal here is to really get into what made his thinking tick, why it was so influential then, and, frankly, why it still matters now.
And he's known as one of the first, maybe the first of the sophists, right? These professional teachers. Plato even gives him credit for inventing that role.
Exactly. And the big idea everyone remembers is that statement, of all things the measure is man. Or, as it's often put, man is the measure of all things.
It sounds quite simple on the surface, but yeah, it unpacks into a whole lot of complexity.
It really does.
So the traditional interpretation, the one you often get first, and largely because of Plato's writings,
Yeah, his critiques.
precisely, that interpretation is that Protagoras was basically saying there's no objective truth. Full stop. Everything's just relative to whoever's looking at it.
But looking a bit closer, it seems like Protagoras might have been getting at something a little more, well, nuanced.
I think so. The idea seems to be less about no truth and more about how our individual experiences, our own histories, even our expectations, profoundly shape our judgments. They shape what we call truth for ourselves.
Can you give an example of that?
Sure. Think about how different people react to the same situation. Is something good or bad, beautiful or ugly, fair or unfair? Your answer often depends heavily on your background, your past experiences.
Like someone who's known hardship might see good fortune completely differently than someone who hasn't.
Exactly. So what Protagoras seems to be highlighting is how this variety of experience challenges any claim to a single universal standard for judging these things.
You can definitely see why that would be provocative, especially for someone like Plato, who was searching for those unchanging, objective realities.
Right. But what's really interesting is the potential implication Protagoras drew from this. It wasn't necessarily just chaos, like anything goes. It seems he might have been arguing that because our perspectives differ, it's crucial for a functioning community, especially a democracy like Athens, to respect those different viewpoints, even if your own experience tells you something different.
So it's about enabling open debate, acknowledging where others are coming from.
Kinda, yeah. Recognizing that truth for one person might not be truth for another, and that's okay, even necessary for public discourse.
Let's talk a bit about his life. Born in Abdera, Thrace, around 490 BC, and there's that amazing story about how he got started in philosophy.
Oh, the porter story, yes.
Yeah.
Aulus Gellius tells it. Apparently, Protagoras was working carrying loads of wood.
Just a regular job.
Right. But the philosopher Democritus saw him and noticed the incredibly precise, almost mathematical way he tied his bundle of wood.
Like, geometrically perfect.
Something like that. Democritus saw this underlying talent for order and spatial thinking, took him in, and started teaching him philosophy. It's a great origin story, whether entirely factual or not.
It really paints a picture. And later he becomes this big name in Athens, friends with Pericles even.
A major figure. Now, the exact dates, they're a bit fuzzy. Plato's dialogues help us estimate he lived maybe 70 years, dying around 420 BC, after a good 40 years teaching as a sophist.
But there's some uncertainty about his death too, right? That whole trial for impiety.
There is. Some later accounts claim he was tried and exiled for his views on the gods, but some modern scholars are skeptical. They think it might be a later embellishment.
Interesting. But regardless, he was clearly influential during his lifetime.
Definitely. And Plutarch tells another story involving him and Pericles. Apparently, they spent a whole day arguing about a legal case.
Oh yeah, what was it about?
An accidental death during an athletic contest. Someone got hit by a javelin. The question they debated was, who's responsible?
Okay, so liability.
But it went deeper. Was it the javelin itself, just an object? Was it the person who threw it? Or maybe the officials who organized the games?
Ah, so it becomes a philosophical puzzle about causation. Very Protagoras.
Exactly. It shows his thinking wasn't just about winning arguments, but about these fundamental questions of responsibility and how we understand events.
Now, even though Democritus was his mentor, they didn't agree on everything. Mathematics, for instance.
That's a key difference. Democritus loved mathematics, saw it as fundamental. Protagoras. Apparently, he was more skeptical about applying those pure abstract geometric ideas directly to the messy, real world we perceive.
How so?
He reportedly said something like, "For perceptible lines are not the kind of things the geometer talks about." suggesting a gap between the ideal forms of geometry and what we actually see and touch, a focus on the empirical.
Makes sense. But he did value skill and learning, didn't he? There's that quote about art and practice.
Art without practice and practice without art are nothing. Yes, it stresses that balance. You need both the know-how and the doing. Theory and application have to go together.
Which fits with his role as a sophist. His main focus was on virtue, wasn't it? And politics.
Very much so. Can virtue be taught? That was a huge question in 5th century Athens, and Protagoras was right in the middle of that debate, arguing that, yes, it could be, and he was the one to teach it.
And his teaching wasn't just narrow debate tricks, was it? It seems broader.
He aimed for a wide understanding of human affairs, language, education, how society works. In Plato's dialogue Protagoras, he actually claims he teaches people how to manage their own lives effectively and how to participate wisely in public affairs.
So practical wisdom, really.
Yes, and part of that involves language itself. He was interested in orthoepia, using words correctly.
Like grammar and meaning.
Exactly. He famously analyzed a poem by Simonides, picking apart the word choices. You can see how useful that skill would be in Athens, especially in the law courts, where interpreting the exact meaning of laws or contracts was crucial.
It's quite down to earth for a philosopher. We hear he even classified different kinds of sentences.
Diogenes Laertius says so. He apparently came up with a system for categorizing speech acts, statements, questions, commands, prayers, and so on. And Aristotle mentions him working on grammatical gender.
He sounds like an early linguist, almost.
In a way, he was clearly fascinated by how language works and how we use it to persuade and understand, and that ties directly into his teaching of rhetoric and argumentation.
We know he wrote books like Technique of Heuristics, The Art of Debate.
Right. And Diogenes Laertius even says he competed in rhetorical contests. He was known for teaching how to argue effectively.
And didn't he have this idea that on any topic there are always two opposing arguments? Logoi, I think?
That's strongly associated with him, yes. The idea that you can argue convincingly for both sides of an issue. It might connect him to that anonymous text, the dissoi logoi, which does exactly that.
But that got him into trouble with some people, didn't it? Aristotle criticized him?
Aristotle took issue with the claim, attributed to Protagoras, to make the weaker argument stronger.
Which sounds potentially unethical.
Well, it raises that fundamental question of rhetoric. Is its purpose to find truth, or just to win the argument, regardless of the merits? It's a debate that's still relevant.
Okay, let's loop back to that core idea. Relativism.
Yeah.
From his book, Truth.
Yes, that's where we get the man as the measure line. The core idea, again, is that each individual person is the ultimate standard for what they perceive and judge.
So what seems true to me actually is true for me.
In essence, yes. The classic example is temperature. If the wind feels cold to me and warm to you,
We're standing right next to each other.
Protagoras would say, well, it is cold for you and it is warm for me. There isn't some absolute temperature truth floating out there, independent of our perception. Truth is relative, individual.
Which implies no absolute truths at all, then.
That's the implication. Truth becomes personal, variable. And, as we said, this is where Plato brings in Socrates to push back hard, arguing for objective realities, objective values that exist independently of us.
Plato called Protagoras' view a kind of phenomenalism, right? What appears to you is real for you.
Correct. But Plato, in the Theaetetus, also adds a layer of nuance to Protagoras' position.
Oh, how so?
Well, Plato has Protagoras acknowledge that some perspectives might be, say, the result of being ill or impaired. So while the sick person might genuinely perceive things differently, that perception isn't necessarily as useful or sound as a healthy one.
So not all subjective truths are created equal in terms of practical value.
Exactly. And this is where Protagoras apparently saw the sophist's role, to teach discernment, to help people cultivate better, more beneficial perspectives. He essentially called this teaching virtue.
Still, Plato and Aristotle weren't convinced. They pointed out a kind of self-contradiction, didn't they?
They did. The classic critique is, if the statement all truth is relative is itself true, then isn't that statement also just relatively true? True for Protagoras, maybe, but not necessarily objectively true for everyone.
So it potentially undermines itself.
It's a powerful philosophical counterargument against thoroughgoing relativism.
Okay, shifting gears slightly. Protagoras wasn't just about relativism. There's also his stance on the gods. Agnosticism.
He's definitely seen as a key early proponent of agnosticism. Some even suggest it bordered on atheism, based on the logic that if you can't know something exists, it's functionally non-existent for practical purposes.
And he wrote about it quite directly.
Famously so. In his work on the gods, he stated something like, "Concerning the gods, I have no means of knowing whether they exist or not, nor of what sort they may be."
Why not?
He cited the obscurity of the subject and the brevity of human life. Basically, it's too hard to know and life's too short to figure it out. That's a remarkably frank admission for his time.
And that's what supposedly led to the book Burning and Expulsion from Athens, according to Diogenes Laertius.
That's the story Diogenes tells. But again, modern historians like John Burnett cast doubt on it.
Mm.
There's a lack of contemporary corroboration. It might be dramatic legend.
But even if the story isn't entirely true, or even if some books were burned,
Enough clearly survived. His ideas were discussed, debated, and transmitted for centuries. Plato wouldn't have spent so much time arguing against them if his works weren't known. It shows his impact.
definitely. And we know he wrote quite a bit, even though only fragments survive now. Antilogy, truth.
Also known as the Throws, interestingly. And Diogenes Laertius lists others. On the gods, art of heuristics, imperative. On ambition, on incorrect human actions, on those in Hades, on sciences, on virtues, on the original state of things. Even one called Trial Over a Fee.
Wow, quite a range. Covers a lot of ground.
It really does, from metaphysics and epistemology to ethics, politics, language, and even the practicalities of his profession.
So pulling it all together, Protagoras emerges as this really pivotal thinker. His focus on individual perspective as the starting point for truth, his work on rhetoric and language, his questioning of divine knowledge, it's quite a legacy.
It absolutely is. He challenged assumptions and forced people to think critically about knowledge, communication, and society.
And perhaps a final thought for you listening. How might Protagoras' ideas about the individual being the measure affect how you view disagreements today?
Does seeing things through that lens help understand why people hold such different beliefs? And maybe, just maybe, does it make you question how solid that idea of a single universal truth really is for everyone in every situation? Something to ponder.